And that's really what this is about. Common sense ways to protect and secure our elections, common sense ways to protect women from having men competing with them in their sports, and also banning transgender mutilation that we've seen for kids. And so I'm going to turn it over to Senator Lee, who's been a great leader on this topic. He's been talking about the Save America Act for some time. He's been working on those provisions. I will point out we've got sort of a lot of these issues that, again, I think are very common sense. They're very supported by the American people. One of the things we want to make sure to do with our elections is make sure they're secure. And it wasn't that long ago that this was a bipartisan effort. 20 years ago, there was something called the Carter-Baker Commission where they came out with recommendations of how you could secure elections. What's the most secure way you can have an election? The most secure way, of course, is in-person voting. One of the dangers that they warned about 20 years ago was mass mail-in balloting. We've seen this play out in places like Georgia where ballots were just sent out. There's really not a lot of chain of custody. Drop boxes are all over the state, and they're ripe for fraud. And so what I'm proposing in the amendment to deal with mail-in balloting fraud and these scams that exist is just to make sure the preference is for in-person voting. We're no longer going to allow ballots to be sent out willy-nilly without verifying addresses. If you have a hardship because of a disability or an illness or because of travel or you're a caregiver or some other hardship that the state can identify, you can vote by absentee. You have to request it, and then you vote absentee. Most states do this. Some of the most secure election procedures in the country are by states that actually allow this. But again, we want to make sure elections are secure. We want to make sure people believe what happens on election night is the final result. We need finality. We need to make sure that we're restoring the trust that the American people deserve and that our republic demands. This experiment of self-government is a uniquely American project that from time to time needs more care. And I think it's an opportunity for us as a Senate to prove that we can actually govern and legislate as opposed to just merely presiding. And I think that's what's on the line here. I'll turn it over to Senator Lee.
Thank you. When I first started working on this bill close to 3 years ago with Congressman Chip Roy from Texas, before we began drafting what became the SAVE Act, what would later become the Save America Act, we sat down and decided that we had two principal objectives. Let's make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. I don't know any Americans who would want anything less than both of those to be achieved through any effort to secure our elections. We can do both. We must try to achieve both. And if we pursue only the former, at the expense of the latter, bad things are going to happen. We can't take on the risk that is entailed anytime you leave a gaping wound, a gaping hole in our election security. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk by a lot of people about protecting our elections, making sure that our institutions don't allow our elections to become vulnerable to the risk of foreign election interference. Nowhere could that be more pronounced than when we allow foreign nationals residing in the United States to cast votes. And we do have this hole in our election security that is the result of a combination of factors that weren't necessarily present, and certainly not to the degree that they are today when Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act in 1993. About 20 years after that law was passed, the Supreme Court of the United States interpreted that same law as prohibiting the states from requiring any type of documentation, any type of proof of citizenship for someone who goes into a DMV and pursuant to the processes available under the NVRA registers to vote while applying for a driver's license. An activity that requires only checking a box and signing one's name, and that's it. Even if the state has affirmative reasons to believe that some are applying to register to vote, including in federal elections, who is not a citizen, or perhaps even a known illegal immigrant, they still may not request it. That's how the Supreme Court interpreted the NVRA, is preempting out and thereby prohibiting the states from asking anything about that. Meanwhile, in nearly every state in the Union, you can apply for a driver's license as a non-citizen. And in 19 states plus the District of Columbia, you may freely get a driver's license even if you are a known illegal immigrant. Meanwhile, between 2021 and 2025, we had between 10 and 15 million people enter this country unlawfully. And so this is a gaping risk when states not only are not seeking to verify citizenship, but they are prohibited by law from doing so, so long as they use this particular procedure to register to vote. We've got a massive problem. Meanwhile, Americans overwhelmingly, like between 80 and 85% of them across this great country, believe that basic protections like voter ID are necessary, that they are common sense. There are countries all over the world that require this, and you have to show an ID when you do all sorts of things, many of which involve the United States government. For example, applying for veterans benefits, for Social Security benefits. Or when you board an airplane, you've got to show them to federal officials, TSA officers. You've got to show who you are and that you're entitled to be where you want to be and do the thing that you want to do. Establishing that you are a person who is entitled to enter into a particular building, a meeting, to get something that you want that will harm others if you are not who you say you are, and if you don't, in fact, have the right to do that thing that you are trying to do. The list gets much longer when you factor in state and local governments and private institutions, whether you're applying for a hunting license, a fishing license, for almost any interaction with your government will require that. If you go to a bank, if you go to a pharmacy, if you go to a healthcare clinic or a hospital, all kinds of things where you have to prove who you are in order to get there. So it's not unreasonable to require these things. So what's the Democrats' response to this? Well, it's a handful of things, but a lot of them boil down to this is racist and sexist to require these things. This is Jim Crow 2.0. This is misogyny in action. Look, that's absolute nonsense. Even Democrat voters across this country, overwhelmingly, like to the tune of 70 or 75% across the country, believe that these things are reasonable and necessary. It's only in Washington, D.C., it's only in the halls of Congress that Democrats find this controversial. That is not acceptable. We do have some vulnerabilities, and the security and the perception of the security of our elections is something that matters. And we are in charge of doing it. Finally, you are hearing an argument that I find stunning from a handful of people who are opposed to this. The argument goes something like this. In the interest of federalism, we have to respect the state's authority to conduct elections. It is, after all, states that perform these elections. We don't want to change that. This bill doesn't change that. But they say it does somehow, and that this is an erosion of state sovereign authority over elections. This is from the same party, people in the same party in Congress who just a few years ago, and we're talking as recently as 2021 and 2022, backed legislation in the form of H.R. 1 in that particular Congress that would have undertaken a wholesale commandeering of the electoral process, including subjecting every voting jurisdiction in America to a de facto status as a Section 5 pre-clearance jurisdiction. In other words, anytime any legislative boundary anywhere in America, whether for a city council, state legislative race, county commission, or otherwise, if you redistricted, you'd have to go to a political appointee in Washington, D.C. for pre-clearance. That was just the beginning of a massive federal takeover of elections and of laws dealing with elections in America. This, by contrast, is narrow. It's narrowly targeted, and it's necessitated by one thing: an existing federal law that has left a gaping vulnerability. In no way, shape, or form is this an erosion of federalism. This is just good government. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. And I just want to make a couple of points to follow up on what Senator Schmidt and Senator Lee articulated. One is you have to ask yourself a very fundamental question. Senator Lee mentioned this. You've got a situation where the vast majority of Americans support voter integrity. They support what we're trying to accomplish with the SAVE Act, and that's very simple. That you should be a United States citizen in order to be able to exercise the precious right to vote. You should be able to prove you are who you say you are when you go to the poll. This is something that 80% of Americans writ large support, over 90% of Republicans, and 71% of Democrats support this as well. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that 47 Democrat United States senators oppose what 71% of Democrats and what over 80% of Americans favor? Who is it that they represent? Is it illegal aliens that shouldn't be voting here? Is it some sort of unspecified special interest, big moneyed interest that's pushing this? Ask yourself that question. Why will Democrat senators oppose this? Why would anybody oppose common sense legislation like this when the vast majority of Americans want to support it? It's a daunting question, and it makes you really concerned. And I think it underscores the reason why we're pushing so hard today to pass the Save America Act, because election integrity does matter. And those that say the opposite have a huge problem. And they should have a huge problem with their constituents. So I urge everyone that's watching this to ask themselves whether their senator is representing them and their interest. And if not, let them hear from you. Because this is inherently un-American to support an issue that would allow non-citizens to vote, that every non-citizen vote that is cast negates and dilutes an American citizen's vote. We're here on this stage today to tell you we won't stand for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here today to talk about the Save America Act. I heard Senator Lee, who has championed this from day one. I am so proud to have been an original co-sponsor here in the Senate, because it is so important that only America our people, we the people, are the ones having a say in what policy gets passed? Only our people, Americans? And what excuses are they giving? Somebody like Senator Blackburn, because she's married, might not be able to vote? I find that very hard to believe. They profess to represent the females of this nation at very convenient times. I'll tell you what party's standing up for the females in this nation. The very people that the Democrats claim that a bill like this will harm are the very people that are demanding it be passed. From Black Americans to Hispanic Americans, the overwhelming majority demand that it be passed. So from day one of showing up here in the halls of Congress, that no one can seem to figure out, I have asked, who and what do the Democratic representatives and senators stand for? Who are they for? Because when the rubber hits the road, when it gets tough, they will always stand up. They'll travel to other nation states to defend criminals. They'll stand up for the cartels. Heck, they'll even stand up for the communists in New York. But when it comes down to standing up for and fighting for the American people, we the people, they suddenly have an excuse. They won't show up. And everyone watching this should ask, who are they for? Because it certainly doesn't seem to be the American citizens that are demanding that this get done. Who are they for? And if you're in a state with a senator that is voting no to the Save America Act, voting no to only Americans voting in American elections, you need to be on that horn, you need to be on that phone, telling them what you think, telling them what you want done, because they work for you. They work for we the people. And I so appreciate the tenacity and the diligence of Senator Lee and everyone that has been pushing the Save America Act forward. And I thank President Trump for not letting up, for showing up every day and reminding us all that we are accountable to we the people. And that's why we do these jobs. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you all for being here today. You know, it is such an imperative that we get this passed. And to the American people, they do not understand why we're not getting it passed. Last night, I had the opportunity to do a telephone town hall. Thousands of Tennesseans were on that town hall. And one of the callers said, I don't get it. Can you please explain to me why the Democrats are blocking the Save America Act? Because it is so common sense that only citizens would vote in our elections. And just as we do in Tennessee, which, by the way, Tennessee has been rated the safest, most secure elections in the country. And how do we rank number one in election integrity? We show an ID. Our voter rolls are up to date. You're a citizen to vote. Common sense. So Tennesseans know when they go to the polls that one person, one vote is respected and it is protected. Now, there are a couple of other things that the president wants to get included in this bill. And you're going to see a couple of amendments. Senator Tuberville will bring forward the amendment that will make certain that men are not in women's sports. Now, just as you've got voter ID and citizenship to vote in elections as a 70, 80, 90% issue, you see that with no men in women's sports. Likewise, the amendment I will lead will bar transgender mutilation of minors nationwide. Again, this is something that is the American people saying we want to see this done. And it is the Republican-led Senate that is responding by saying we will take this up and we will get this done.
Open it up for questions. Sure. Yeah.
Can I ask actually, Senator Lee, if this bill became law and these provisions were immediately implemented in this year's elections, which is my understanding of how that would work, what would happen in Utah, which is one of the 8 states that have all mail voting, and my understanding is 91% of voters use the mail option. How would this work in your home state? And what do you say to voters who would suddenly find themselves under a different system? Would they have time to get the right documentation with the state, have the time and resources to implement it in time for primaries that might already been underway?
Yeah. First of all, it's important to point out that the bill that we're now debating, the House-passed Save America Act, doesn't have that in that. Doesn't have the termination or the severe restrictions on mail-in balloting. There are some ramifications for mail-in balloting that relate to voter registration, but it doesn't end that. There are several amendments pending, including the substitute amendment that Senator Schmidt has, that if adopted, could result in that. Look, my state is very capable. If should that amendment pass and the bill as a whole become law with that in there, I'm confident that Utah can catch up and that other states can do that as well. Now, look, Utah handles mail-in balloting in a manner that is safer than how most states handle it. We don't allow ballot harvesting. We've got pretty good signature verification procedures in place to discourage the risk of cheating, of fraud one way or another. Nonetheless, there are reasons why in the past the United States has chosen not to go in that direction. There are reasons why most countries still won't go in that direction. In the long haul, even if you're a state like Utah that doesn't allow ballot harvesting, as a lot of states do, and that has good signature verification and other protocols in place, in the long haul, these things do present a pretty significant risk of fraud. And so that's why I think it's important for us to push it. And I think Senator Schmidt is right to include that in his substitute amendment, which I'm an original co-sponsor. So
We taught voters who might find themselves no longer able to vote by mail as they're used to, at least not in the way, they might have new standards or...
sure, if they need to, they can still do it. If they are homebound because of illness or disability, or because they're deployed militarily, or because they're going to be absent for whatever reason.
91% of people.
Sure, because we rely on it currently. But when you look at the fact that people are able to adjust, like most states, it hasn't been that long since we didn't have widespread use of de facto universal mail-in balloting. We could do it again. The fact that they've grown accustomed to it doesn't mean that we couldn't adjust yet again.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, sir.
Sure.
So the Save America Act is already having a pretty tough time getting passed. Why add an amendment that appears to make its road forward even tougher?
Well, the other issues that are on here are also 80-20 issues. The only reason it's tough to pass is because the Democrats want to cheat. That's the truth. So when you boil all of this down, they want non-citizens to vote. That's what when they vote no, they will be voting to have non-citizens vote, to weaken our election integrity, to allow men to compete with women in sports, and to allow for transgender mutilation to continue for kids. So the Senate isn't just a museum. It's not a retirement home for proceduralism. We actually should draw lines, and the American people should know where we stand. And we support election integrity. We support protecting women and girls. We support protecting kids. So that's what this debate is all about. And the Democrats are on the wrong side of the issue. Yeah.
Why not, Senator? Do you think that...
Well, I will tell you. So to answer your question, let me answer. It is a priority of the President of the United States to have the substitute amendment that is now pending together. That is his position. Leader Thune, that is his position, and that is my position. Yes.
Thank you, Senator. Just piggybacking off of Lindsay's question on this issue of how states will have to implement the changes in this legislation. Should there be funding attached to this legislation as a result to help states like Utah accomplish that? And secondly, as you guys know, Leader Thune has indicated that he will file cloture at some point at the end of this process. Do you plan on trying to do anything to prevent that from happening? And if so, what would your strategy be to try to prevent?
My feeling is we should debate this as long as it takes to get it done. And I think that people are very familiar with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I think most folks back home think that's actually how it works. That people come here and they can stand on conviction and not be so cynical as to believe that people don't have to earn blocking things that are popular with the American people. As far as implementing this, look, until 2020, and I have some experience with this because I was Attorney General in Missouri, when Mark Elias and his leftist lawyers went to every state to try to water down and eliminate protections. They filed 3 lawsuits against Missouri. We had an absentee balloting program where if you had a hardship, you could request one. It's worked very well. It's very similar to what this is. They wanted to blow all that up to make the voting regime much more likely for fraud to occur. That's what this debate is all about. States, by the way, I think what you also see states be pretty creative. They probably will have mobile election units. The election authority can decide what that hardship is and how to make sure that the maximum number of people who can vote. But there's no question, again, this was a bipartisan conclusion for a very long time. The safest and most secure way is in-person voting. And there still is a process by which people can request absentee ballots if they're in the military, if they're homebound, if they're ill, they have a disability, they're a caregiver, or another hardship that state election authority comes up with. Yeah. Yeah.
Senator Lee, this is the president's number one priority. It seems to have strong public support, especially among Republican voters. Do you think there will be any political consequences for Republicans if they just settle for a failed cloture vote next week, or they do not embark on the talking filibuster or add this to a must-pass legislation like FISA reauthorization?
I think it would be a suicidal move for us as Senate Republicans, for Republicans in general, if we don't put everything we've got into this. And I agree with and want to echo what Senator Schmidt just said on that point. I think we need to debate this as long as it takes to get it done. And if we're not there yet, we need to continue debating it. So getting it teed up, beginning debate, and then immediately proceeding to cloture on the bill, not to be confused with cloture on an amendment, but cloture on the bill, would be, I think, a profound mistake. And so that's why I think a prolonged period of debate, particularly on a bill that itself has overwhelming support from the American people, is what's in order. Remember, the example that I've often used in connection with this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, at the time that was passed by the House of Representatives in March of 1964, I believe that bill had approval in the low to mid 50% range, 51 to 54% roughly. When it came over to the Senate from the House, they were, according to some estimates, 32 votes shy of cloture. So they had a 32-vote cloture deficit. Our current cloture deficit is 10, significantly smaller than the cloture deficit they faced then, with a much more popular bill and a bill that is far simpler than the Civil Rights Act of 64. Now, I get it. They're not the same bill. They do different things. I don't mean to overstate the comparison. But the point was the Senate debated that for a lengthy period of time. For all the Americans who have benefited from what has been achieved since the Civil Rights Act of 64 was passed, because of the fact that it was passed, I'm sure all those Americans can look back on that with gratitude for the fact that the Senate didn't just throw up its hands and say, well, we're 32 votes shy of cloture. I guess it can't happen. Let's have a failed cloture vote and move on. They didn't do that. Instead, they continued to debate until a few things happened. The opponents of it became physically exhausted. They also became sort of the victims of political exhaustion with their voters as this bill was becoming more popular. And they could see the writing on the wall that this was going to continue. They started looking for ways to make face-saving adjustments and some substantive changes to it through amendments. And it was through that process that they were able to close the 32-vote cloture deficit, and took them 60 days, but they got it done. I think the same thing can happen here.
You can talk until Lester's still doing the deal at this point.
Well, yeah, look, I see that regardless of what nomenclature you want to use, what word you want to assign to what we're doing, I see this as a form of talking cloture filibuster, or if somebody rejects the idea that this technically fits within that, it is very talking filibuster-like what we are doing. We're getting on a bill, we're debating that bill, we're doing so without any plan to immediately file cloture on the bill, and hope to keep this up for some time, I hope many weeks if necessary, in order to close that gap.
Okay, last question.
Just add one point to Senator Lee's, and that is things are different than they were back in the 1960s. We're having this press conference today because we're going directly to the American people. The Democrat Party has decided to set aside the will of the American people in the case of the SAVE Act. They're doing the same thing with the Department of Homeland Security as well. They're shutting that down at a time when we have a huge national security threat with hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranians in this country who've already had sleeper cells invoked. They're freezing funding for that. This is our opportunity to go direct to the American public. We're doing it with this press conference today, and I encourage everybody to tune in to see what happens on the floor and to ask themselves, how is it that the Democrats could possibly justify the unjustifiable? How is it that they could justify advocating for non-citizens to vote in our elections? How is it that they could justify the insecurity that they seem to want to perpetuate in our voting system when they have the opportunity right before them to fix this problem? The American people will see this, and they can speak loudly. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Your colleagues have been skeptical about talking to about this and work from this truthful, including leadership. Can you point to examples in the past where the talking to Lester or two-speech rule have been used to pass bills without getting the closer threshold of the vote?
Yeah. Again, I'll point back to the Civil Rights Act of 64. Yes, they ended that with cloture, but they ended that with cloture after they had been able to close the cloture gap. I have not for many months believed that we would win this directly through enforcement of Rule 19's two-speech rule in paragraph 1A. Whether as a result of the October 25th, 1986 precedent on that or otherwise, there are enough ways in which that by itself could be extended for a sufficient period of time. I just don't think that it would be likely to end that way. I think it's much more likely that members grow physically exhausted and exhausted of contradicting many of their voters. And so over time, as things get debated, the public becomes more familiar with the legislation. People start to get comfortable with it. Once they understand what the arguments are, once we have the chance more fully to continue to make the case that we've been making, to rebut the absurd insofar as they characterize the bill, counterfactual arguments they're making about this. This is going to become popular enough that a lot of our colleagues who currently oppose it, I believe, will start to get on board. There's a lot of disinformation floating around. Well, yes, I believe we can get there, but we've got to debate it. We've got to give it time, and we've got to master the arguments. There are still all kinds of arguments being made about it that are not true. A lot of people are saying, for example, some of my Democratic colleagues have been saying things like everybody's going to have to re-register to vote. Now, that's not true. If you're already registered to vote, that voter registration doesn't cease to exist under this. That simply isn't true. There are people saying that if you don't have documents, you're going to have to pay $200 to get a passport. Also not true. Anybody who says that, look at page 12, line 22, and the text that follows from that. In the House-passed Save America Act, which we are now debating before the Senate, it makes true that that is not true. Even if you, let's say, for example, sometimes it comes up, suppose a woman who has gotten married and taken on the last name of her husband after getting married, can't find her marriage certificate, which is one of the documents that will suffice to close that gap. Or let's suppose somebody else can't find not only that document, but can't find any of their documents because their house burned down, their dog ate it, they never had them to begin with, or whatever. You go to page 12, line 22, and the text that follows from that, it makes clear that a person in that instance, whether they're missing one document or all of their documents, can, by affidavit, submit a sworn statement outlining the facts supporting their citizenship. So if they are natural-born citizens, for example, they could identify the city, state, and date where they were born, describe the circumstances of their parents. If they are naturalized citizens, describe the date or date range in which they were naturalized, where they came from. That then flips the burden onto the state to confirm or refute what they have assessed, and they have to make a judgment call. As they have to go in and do the research and figure out citizenship. The state can do that for them, and that would work. So things like this all over the place are being refuted every day. As that continues to happen, these arguments are going to continue to fall down for the pretextual, non-effective, and counterfactual arguments that they are. That's how we're going to win. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.